Hey, what's up everybody? This is Pete and welcome back to another episode of Underdog Garage. It's time for part 2 of the chassis rail repair series where we're fixing the rusted out chassis rails on our 2003 Mazda MX5 Miata. In this part of the series, we're going to be installing the new chassis rail patch panels, the replacement panels from the Welding Corner. And I just wanted to give them another quick shout out for helping me source these panels and for giving me some advice on how to tackle this job. If you want to check them out, I've linked their website and their Facebook page in the description below. This was a challenging but very rewarding part of the repair, and I'm really excited to share my process of going through it with you. But enough of me talking about it, let's go ahead and get into installing these new chassis rails. First, I needed to remove as much residual rust as possible from the metal so I would have a good clean metal surface to weld to. I also needed to remove any of the remaining chassis rail inner bracing that was left behind from the initial removal. In order to get to one damaged section of the rail, I had to remove the AC condenser mounting bracket temporarily. This would give me access to replace the rusted metal behind it. During this whole process, I'm regularly placing the rail in position to see how everything is lining up. Most important is making sure all my measurements are correct, but this just gives me a general idea of the progress I'm making on fixing the chassis rail. Since I have access to the inside of the rail, I'm using a die grinder with a roll-lock disc to grind away some of the surface rust on the inside. The inside of the rail will get coated with wax oil once the new panel is installed. And I'm also grinding off surface rust on the underside of the rail so I can get a good clean weld there. I placed a patch piece of metal where the AC condenser sits and I started to grind it back so the replacement rail can fit properly. Once I've gotten everything lined up how I want it, I start taking measurements and verifying that they are the same or pretty close to my original measurements before I removed the original rail. I'm giving myself a 1/16 of an inch of margin since the metal was so distorted originally, but that's about it. Once I've got my measurements all correct, I set a reference mark to double check in case things get jostled or something accidentally moves. I'm using 2 C-clamps to hold the panel in position while I grind off the surface and prepare the panel for welding. Once I was confident I had everything in place, I started welding. I used a 3rd C-clamp to horizontally pinch the chassis rail piece against the car frame. This pressure helped me to get a better bonding during the initial welding and tacking phase. I placed tacks on both sides of the rail and the undersides. Once I was confident it was holding, I removed the 2 C-clamps and I checked my measurements again in case something moved. Once I confirmed the measurements were correct and everything was looking good, I then started running beads between the tacks. I'd run a bead about every 3 inches or so. And if you're wondering, yes, those are leather gardening gloves. Some days you just have one of those off days and, well, you somehow forget your welding gloves, so you gotta improvise. They actually worked better than I expected. Once everything was ground down as best as possible, I coated everything in a primer coating. I wasn't too concerned with perfect looks because the whole engine bay was getting repainted with Por 15. Also, inside the wheel arch was going to get a rubberized undercoating to prevent any sort of future rust. Once it was all coated in primer, I used a seam sealer around the joints to help prevent moisture buildup. The car was then prepped for paint and repainted with Por 15. Then the chassis rails were coated with a rubberized undercoating for further protection, and the job was done. Alright, so our replacement chassis rails are in, and the Miata's frame is looking great. Everything lined up perfectly, and the suspension components went in perfectly and installed nicely. There were a couple things that I did not get on film that I wanted to point out to you. The first thing was I tested the sway bar fitment, so I took the 2 sway bar mounts and I bolted them in with the 4 bolts on each side, and then I took the sway bar and I mounted it loosely in position just to make sure everything was lining up correctly and the sway bar looked like it was in the correct position, which it was. Once the rails were completely in and I had put the AC brackets back into their original position, I then tested the fitment of the AC condenser, and that also lined up perfectly. In part 1, I did have one viewer comment that one thing he did was to check the AC condenser fitment and the radiator fitment as well as the sway bar fitment before finishing off the entire project, which I think is a good idea just to double check, even though you have the measurements. The one other thing I didn't film was putting wax oil inside of the rails. As a rust preventative measure, I took a fluid film wax oil and sprayed it all inside of the rail, basically through the top holes in the top rail and through the front of the rail since it was exposed. I will probably recoat the inside of the rails periodically with wax oil, maybe once a year, just to maintain that level of protection. The biggest challenge I think I had with working on this repair was welding inside the wheel well. So inside the wheel well, you have that upper shelf of metal. It's tricky to get a good gun angle to weld the top edge. So I had to use a little bit more stick out on the welding gun than I would have liked. But overall, I think the job came out pretty good and it's nice and secure in there. Once we get the engine back in the car, we're going to take it for its first test drive in a long time. And fingers crossed, I don't end up on one side of the road and my front end on the other side of the road. So hopefully it goes well, but I'll be excited to share that with you as well. All right, that's it for this episode. Thanks so much for watching. We really appreciate it. Make sure you give it a thumbs up if you liked the video. Leave a comment or question down below if you got it. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future videos on this project and other projects we got going on at Underdog Garage. So thanks again, have fun, stay motivated, and we'll see you next time.